So with that, uh, check out the poll, and we want to get started. We want to thank you for joining us. I'm Cheryl Court with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. I'm the policy director for DC and Prince George's County, and I'm here with my colleague Carrie Kasicki, I'll hand it off to in a second. But we just wanted to thank you for joining us. This is the third in our Coalition for Smarter Growth webinar series on housing and working with leading researchers, policymakers, and advocates focused on solutions for our region's housing crisis. And we brought together a panel of experts today to shed light on the question, does more housing make housing more affordable? And so I'm really actually very excited to hear from this panel. I think it's a terrific panel, and I think that's why we've had such a great response. And so I actually want to turn it over to my colleague, Carrie, to give us a few tips on how we're going to proceed and then introduce our moderator.
Hi all, thank you so much for being here. We have a really great crowd. I'm seeing answers come in the poll. We have a lot of people from Montgomery County. We have a lot of people from DC, and all over the region. So my name is Carrie Kasicki. I'm the Maryland Housing Advocacy Manager here at CSG. And I'm going to be available to help folks with tech support or anything that comes up today. So we're going to, we have the chat open right now. Keep sharing, where you're from, why you're here today. But once we get our panelists' presentation started, we're going to turn that chat off just to minimize distractions. But there are still two ways that you can reach us and share your thoughts during this event. So first of all, if you have any questions or issues with audio or video, you can reach me even after we turn the chat off by hovering over my video window in Zoom, and you'll see like three little dots in the corner that you can click and then send me a chat. So I'll be keeping an eye on that if anybody needs a hand. And then we'll also have a chance for audience questions at the end. So after our panelists present, we'll turn on the Q&A feature in Zoom, and you'll be able to share your questions for our amazing panelists. So with that, I'm honored to turn it over to Claudia Wilson Randall. Claudia is the Executive Director of the Community Development Network of Maryland, which is also the parent organization for the Affordable Housing Organization, Montgomery Housing Alliance in Montgomery County. She's more than 2 decades of experience in community development, housing, and nonprofit leadership at the local and state level. And so I can't think of anyone better to lead us in conversation today. Claudia, handing it over to you. Take us away.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to serve as your moderator this afternoon. Again, I'm Claudia Wilson Randall. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Development Network of Maryland. Um, and I'm happy to be here today to kick off the conversation about housing and how to make housing more affordable. Um, and what the relationship is between housing production and affordability. I hope that we have the chance to learn about the latest research on housing production and explore policy tools to create homes for current and future residents in the region and across the range of incomes. I look forward to a great discussion today about what happens when we build more houses and what happens to prices and what happens when we don't. Um, I think, Carrie, you did a great job in kind of setting the ground rules. I'm not going to read our speakers' bios because I feel like everyone can do that on their own time. But I'm just going to say a couple of introductory words and try to keep the conversation moving along. So I'm going to give each speaker about 7-8 minutes to talk, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I also encourage you, as people are speaking, please put questions in the chat so we can have them lined up at the end. And also continue the dialogue after this session is over today so that we have a chance to interact with folks about what they're doing in their own community, what they need, research available, numbers, and all of that. So with that, I'm just going to kick it off. Today, we're going to kick it off with Dr. Kate Howell from the National Center for Smart Growth and Research and Education. Kate is an associate professor in Urban Studies and Planning program. And prior to coming to the National Center, she was the co-founder and co-director at the Richmond, Virginia Eviction Lab at Virginia Commonwealth University. And she has a PhD from the University of Texas in Austin. And with that, I'm going to just turn things over to you, Kate, and love to hear about the updated Maryland needs assessment.
Okay, well, I'll talk a little bit about that and I'll talk a few. I'm going to try to keep it pretty local to the region because that's really where my specialty is here. So I'm just trying to find, there's my slides. Good. Let me get the slideshow. And we're good to go. All right. Great. So introductions already happened. That makes my life easier. So we have this question, right? Does more housing make housing more affordable? And I have to say, like, it just reminds me of like what we used to say in at the aughts of like, well, it's complicated, right? Because the answer is yes and no. And because you have to ask the question for whom, where, and when that's going to happen. Because timeline matters, people matter, and the place matters, geography matters. And so, the story we often hear is you add more housing. Older housing does what's called filtering, and so it filters down, meaning it's the older housing or the housing with fewer amenities, or maybe it's a little bit further from transit. Slightly less desirable housing becomes more affordable as new product comes on the market. Well, we know that this is kind of getting a little bit broken, the sort of filtering process. And so that kind of can mess things up a little bit here. But we also know that if we don't have supply, we can't solve a problem. So it becomes messy. But I think that that's just kind of an important stage setting. And I get to be the professor who says these things, and that's what professors do, right? We make things really complicated and say, well, I'm not going to give you the answer, but here's the answer. I'll move on from there. So the picture that we see when you're in the region, this is older data. I think Yonah's got some more updated data, but this was really looking between 2019 and 2023. And the bottom line is we produced in our region a heck of a lot of housing. And you can see here, right, DC actually accounted for nearly a third of all production. It was more than actually Loudoun, Fairfax, and Montgomery County combined. Which is huge, right? We're producing a lot of housing and it feels like that. You're on the ground and you're looking and you're like, wow, look at all these cranes in the air. Look at these new buildings coming up. My neighborhood is changing, or the downtown is changing, or, all of these pieces, right? Um, and so that's a really important context to say. But then everyone says, yeah, but DC is still not affordable. So clearly, is it working? And there's a kind of bigger picture to be had here, right? And that is that when you look at and this is from the Maryland Comptroller's Office, they put out a report this year that was looking at housing production as a sort of population, an economy problem. And so you look at Maryland's numbers, they're sort of newly permitted housing units by thousand households, right? And it turns out that despite all this production, certainly Maryland is not producing that they're sort of low relative to the region, right? You look at Virginia, you look at the district, and we're not producing nearly enough housing for what we need. And that gets a little tricky, right? And so we asked this question, why is housing still so expensive? And so to do that, I thought, well, why don't I just do what I do and just talk about local things? And so I'll focus on two case studies, the first of which is College Park. So if anyone's familiar with College Park, maybe you went to the University of Maryland at some point in the past 20 years, and if you went 20 years ago or earlier than 20 years ago, and you've been on Route 1, you're going to say, wow, I don't even recognize the place. The one bar that's there, yeah, it's still there. But so are now a bunch of other places to eat and drink and go to. And good Lord, maybe it looks like a canyon to you. There's all these housing units. And this is the story, right? Is that we went from having fewer than 1,000 units in multifamily buildings to more than 5,000. In fact, we have 7,200 apartments or units permitted or, excuse me, in the pipeline or built along Route 1 in the past 15 years. This is huge. This is a big story. And it's a good story to tell because, right, like the University of Maryland has 40,000 students. It's captive demand, right? You're always going to have students who want to live near campus. And so this is actually kind of interesting. We introduced this to really say you have 7,200 apartments, 2,000 new dorm rooms. Only 38% of students live in College Park, however, right? And of those, the majority of them are living on campus. So we've got 4,500 students are living off campus. So what does that mean? That means there's still tons of demand. Tons of demand. Students still want to live near campus. That said, the rents have stayed stable over the past 15 years. So when you look at rents normalized by normalized for inflation, you actually see rents that remain stable. The other piece that's important is that the renter-occupied single-family homes have also remained relatively stable. In fact, from if you take a longer time horizon, the number of students living in the number of single-family rentals in College Park has decreased significantly. So, right, this is changing kind of the population. It's still here, and everyone's like, yeah, but rents haven't gone down. Right. That's actually really important. In College Park, rents have not decreased. But students were living somewhere, and students are going to keep living somewhere. So those students are opening up housing somewhere else, right? And so we have to think about, yes, we have this kind of space of College Park, and there's a lot of great reasons to build density because, right, that's reducing the number of students who are driving, the number of students who have cars in College Park. That's reducing sort of the footprint of students across the region. But it's also importantly impacting regional housing questions. But it's not going to decrease costs in the same way that we like to think. And that's for a couple of reasons, right? One is that the way that housing is financed, right? If you took a 10% hit on your home value, right? If you own a house, what happens if the home value is decreased by 10%? Well, we knew what happens. That was the 2009 recession, and that means you're upside down on your housing. And similarly, right, housing is financed with an assumption of rents at certain levels, and so that's going to actually have huge impacts for the ability to maintain your debt service or pay your bills as a building owner. So there's all sorts of reasons why this can be problematic, but you also have to look beyond that particular geography. That said, that also has a question about affordability. So I'll use my second case, which is Columbia Heights in Washington, D.C., and some of the numbers I have are a little bit dated. So I will look at this, right? If you know Columbia Heights, in 2008, they opened the Target there, which was kind of a big deal, which also opened significant housing across the area. Because on 13 acres of city-owned land, they had a lot of leverage. Now, back at that time, DC did not have inclusionary zoning, so everything was kind of individually negotiated. We also didn't have the regulations around city-owned property. So now, if you have a piece of city-owned land in DC, 30% of the units have to be affordable. That was not in place at that time, so each property was individually negotiated. So as a result, right, yes, we increased the number of housing units by about 35% or more. But we only got about 250 units at most of inclusionary zoning for that time period. And that's not very much. But we still have in this neighborhood more than 20% of the units that are income restricted at very deep levels. And why is that? Well, because we actually also focused on preservation of affordable housing. Right? If you build a whole bunch of apartments, but then you put a hole in the bottom of the bucket, losing your affordable housing, you're not really getting much affordability. So that's really critical, is actually doing that preservation work. And Columbia Heights, as it turns out, if you've ever been up and down 14th Street, I could give a really boring housing tour, and I've done that. But there's a lot of income restricted housing with deep affordability using Section 8 contracts. So that's based on the tenant's income, not based on the regional median. So you have actually very deeply affordable housing that's allowed for that ongoing 20% income restricted. Now, is this a win? Not purely, because, right, we still lost a lot of unsubsidized affordable housing throughout the neighborhood. But this was really important to keeping people in place. It's a pairing to increasing the number of housing units, right? So that's kind of an important story. So what does that mean, though? We go back to this, why don't we keep it affordable? I don't have the numbers for DC. I think Yonah might, but we have a huge shortage just in Maryland, right? For extremely low-income renters. We have really shortages across the board and across all jurisdictions. And so we are starting out in a hole, right? Like, so we're starting out from behind. And so we can't just sort of say, well, we built some in College Park and we built some in Columbia Heights and we built some down at the Wharf. It has to be really thinking about it, right? Because DC, right, 80% of the city's land is still zoned single family. So that means that we still have a lot of capacity just in the district, much less across the region. So I think that that's kind of the story, is that we have to, yes, look locally, but understand that this is a regional conversation. And I think with that, I can turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you so much. We're going to move right along to Dr. Yonah Freemark from Urban Institute. And I'm just going to kick it right over to him and not make a very deep introduction, but Dr. Freemark is the Principal Research Associate of Fair Housing and Land Use and Transportation, and the lead research director in land use and the land use lab for the Urban Institute. But thank you so much for being here today, and just let's keep rolling.
Thanks, Claudia. I appreciate it. And I'm excited to be here at this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. All right, let's see. Okay, so I'm here to build on some of the insight that Kate just provided, and I think I will be built on myself by Tushar in just a minute. But hopefully it provides some additional information both at the national and DC regional context. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about the current housing market and its relationship to historical trends. So the first thing worth emphasizing is that across the United States, the amount of construction of new housing has been declining quite substantially over the past few decades. So what this graph is telling us is the per capita number of housing units built per thousand residents of the United States between 1968 and 2025. And what this graph is telling us is that actually we used to build substantially more housing per capita in the 1960s, 1970s, into the 1980s. We went up into the 2000s a little bit, but since the Great Recession, so since about 2008, 2009, we've really struggled to come back. And the amount of housing we're building is just quite low compared to the number of people who live in the United States. And there are a number of reasons to suspect that the lack of new construction compared to the number of people who live in this country is contributing to higher housing costs for people throughout the country. So what this graph is telling us is how median incomes have changed versus home prices, both overall in the United States and in the DC region specifically. And this graph, nothing here is adjusted for inflation, which means they're comparable statistics. And essentially what you can see is that between 1975 and about the turn of the millennium in 2000, median incomes, US housing prices, and DC region housing prices all increased at a relatively steady rate. They increased similar to one another. But after 2000, there was a dramatic boom in housing prices, especially in the DC region, as you see there in yellow. And that boom vastly out increased the increase in median incomes that people were receiving. And the same thing has happened over the course of the past 15 years or so, where there's been a steady increase in housing prices, both DC and US overall, that have vastly increased at a higher rate than median income. So that means we have an increasing housing affordability problem that likely has something to do with the lack of housing construction over that same period. Now, what's particularly concerning is that we are currently facing a major crisis in housing permitting, especially in the city of DC, but actually throughout all of the DC region and across the United States. So what this graph is telling us is that essentially, across DC, across the DC region, and across the nation, there was an increase in housing construction between about 2010 and 2022, 2023. Okay, that's why the lines went up over that period. However, since 2022, since 2023, there's been a dramatic decline in housing permitting in DC, an 80% decline in permitting, which is just wild. There's been a 35% decline in permitting in the suburbs of DC, and nationwide, there's been about a 25% decline in permitting. So we were already doing a bad job in building housing in the years coming up to the current moment, but over the past 2 or 3 years, it's become a disaster, frankly, throughout the country. And one of the key explanations for that has been the rising cost of construction and inability to finance new housing throughout our country. So if you look at, we conducted a series of different models at the Urban Institute to understand whether projects were financeable in DC, just as a sort of prototypical model. And one of the things that became very apparent to us is that with low interest rates on debt it was actually feasible to finance all different sorts of projects. We're talking about debt costs of 0 to 2 or 3%. You could actually finance most projects in DC. And that's part of the reason why there was such a building boom up until 2022 or so. There was very low cost debt. However, there has been a vast increase in the cost of debt. So like mortgage costs for homeowners or construction debt for investors that has made actually almost every project almost impossible to finance in the city of DC specifically. And that's why there's been this just giant destruction of housing construction. And that's something that's going to make it really challenging to generate new housing. Now, what do we know about where housing is built and why it's being built in some places versus other places? So the first thing that I want to emphasize is that housing investment tends to concentrate in certain development zones and not in other development zones. And so I just provided some maps here of an analysis we did of Chicago. And what you can see on these maps is that essentially permitting and housing construction in the city of Chicago over the past 20 years has been massively focused in just the central areas of that city, despite the fact that Chicago is, a dense city with theoretically the ability to build everywhere. And what we know from national studies is that development tends to be located in areas that have a few key attributes. They have high incomes, have high educational attainment, have a moderate share of white population, so not too many white people and not too few white people, and have accommodating zoning. And I'm going to sort of end this conversation by talking about the zoning issue because that's key to this conversation. And related to that is the reality of where subsidized affordable housing is built. And we've looked at this in Washington, D.C., also in the Puget Sound, which is the Seattle region. And we found that systematically, subsidized housing is concentrated in just a few parts of each community. So in the Puget Sound, it's concentrated in only the areas where multifamily, high-density housing can be built. That's what you see in these yellow areas. In Washington, D.C., it is absolutely concentrated east of the Anacostia River, and certainly there's almost no subsidized housing west of Rock Creek Park. And that is indicative of the reality of subsidized housing throughout the country. So what do we know about land use policies and their impacts on housing supply? Tushar will get more into this, but just to be very quick about going through this, in theory, we think and hope that if we change the land use policies or the zoning policies in any individual cities, we can generate more building, which can reduce competition for housing units and ultimately produce more housing affordability. We do know that if we change the zoning to upzone to allow for more density in housing units, there is some evidence that over the long term, especially with large upzonings, you will get additional housing construction. So there's productivity there. However, it takes some time in many cases to actually get housing to be built. And this is especially true in the context of things like accessory dwelling units or other sorts of different types of housing that can be built at a sort of easier pace. We also know that downzoning, meaning making it more difficult to build housing, reduces construction systematically. Now, in terms of housing affordability, over the short term, when you upzone parcels, those parcels become more valuable because essentially developers are able to build more on them. But over the long term, we believe that upzoning is likely to reduce rents in these areas, but it really depends on the specific community in terms of the outcomes. And to repeat it again, downzoning has really problematic outcomes. It will increase housing costs and make places less affordable for people to live in. So that was my quick overview. I'm excited about hearing from Tushar and then having the conversation with everybody.
Thank you so much. I just want to keep the conversation going. Really appreciate Tushar Kansal from Pew Charitable Trust for being here today. Tushar works with Pew's Housing Policy Initiative and on research and analysis and ways to increase housing availability and safe home financing. So I look forward to hearing from Tushar, just continuing the conversation. Please also, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A now and we can queue them up so that we're ready for a robust discussion when everybody's through their presentation. Thank you so much. Tushar?
Thank you, Claudia. Give me a second here as I share my screen. All right. All right, there we go. Yes, thanks again for the kind introduction, Claudia, and to Kate and Yonah for your comments. As Yonah mentioned, I am going to be building on kind of some of the themes that he mentioned, and really talking about the circumstances that we've seen in which allowing more homes does in fact improve affordability and also reduces homelessness, very importantly. So I want to start by noting that what the data that we've looked at, this is research from Pew, is that over the past 10 years or so, the shortage of housing that we've seen, and Yonah spoke to this, has really hurt the low and moderate income households in America the most. And so what these bars are showing is that the rents have increased the most in the lowest income zip codes. And the kind of dynamic here, the way that this happens is as follows. So imagine, you're a high income household and you are renewing your lease in your apartment and it jumps up by more than you want to pay. You have the option to go to a kind of moderate middle income, I should say middle rent building and rent an apartment there. Same for those middle income folks. They, if the rent goes up more than they want to pay, they can go to a lower rent building and rent there. However, once you get to those kind of low rent buildings and apartments, those tenants don't really have anywhere else to go, right? They're already in, generally speaking, some of the cheapest apartments in that city or that metro area. And so when there's more competition for those apartments, landlords are naturally going to increase the rent. And so that's why you see the biggest squeeze, the biggest increases in rent in kind of the most affordable apartments, or in this case, the most affordable zip codes. I will say that this also applies to the homeownership market. You can imagine that, everyone knows that, hey, like that neighborhood, the homes are too expensive now. Like I'm going to go over to the next most affordable, a cheaper neighborhood, something like that, right? Now, when lower income folks get squeezed like this, that's how a lot of folks, unfortunately, have ended up paying more than 30%, in many cases, more than 50% of their income on rent. And in the worst cases, this is how people end up doubling up with family or friends, maybe living out of their car, and in the worst cases, homeless, right? Speaking of homelessness, we see that homelessness increased the most in areas where rent has increased the most. And so if you look at these bars, the orange bars on the left, these are some of the cities where rents have gone up during this 5-year period by, 40, 50, 60%. And in the solid orange bars, you see that homelessness has really skyrocketed by kind of large double-digit percentages in many of these cities. It's much more so than in the United States as a whole in those gray bars, and significantly more so than some of those cities represented by the blue bars. In those cities, they built more housing, which I'll get into in a couple minutes here, and rent increased much more slowly, just by 10, 12, 13%, and they were able to actually reduce their homeless population, the percentage of residents who are homeless, very importantly. So there are some cities here, for example, that have kind of figured out the secret sauce here to how it is that building more housing can increase affordability. And so the 4 cities that we've profiled on this slide are Minneapolis, New Rochelle, New York, which is in suburban New York City, Portland, Oregon, and right here in Virginia, Northern Virginia, is Tysons. And these places largely have made it much easier to build apartment buildings, especially on commercial streets. They have reduced parking, they're kind of required parking mandates that developers are forced to build with new homes. And you can just go out to Tyson's, and probably many of the folks on this webinar have, and see how much housing has been added there. As a result, these cities have kept rent growth much, and these are all rapidly growing areas. These are kind of growing cities and towns, and they have kept rent growth much lower than the United States overall. And this is, when you adjust for income growth over this same time period, effective rents have actually decreased in these places. I want to note that that cities that have built the most, and Yonah had talked about, I think he mentioned a building boom, kind of in the early part of this decade when interest rates were low, and a lot of American cities were building a lot of housing, particularly apartments and larger apartment buildings. So these are 11 of the largest cities, or the 11 largest cities, that added at least 10% to their housing stock or their housing supply. And what you see here is that affordability increased the most. In other words, effective rents went down the most in what the real estate industry calls Class C buildings. Class C is just the industry's way of saying these are the kind of tend to be the oldest, cheapest apartments, right? Class A is what a lot of folks will call luxury. Class B are kind of like, middle of the road apartments, and Class C apartments are the most affordable apartments. And the reason here is basically an inversion of what I showed on my second slide, that when the pressure on this part of the market eases up, because there's just a lot more apartments available in, a place like Austin or San Antonio or Salt Lake City or any of these places, landlords can't increase the rent as much. Tenants have more options. They can shop around. And as a result, landlords have to give either just, decrease the rent or offer kind of concessions like 1 month free, things like that. And as a result, effective rent increases. I should note that, while all of these cities did build some subsidized affordable housing, which is a super important part of the housing market, an important part of the solution, the vast majority of the building happened in kind of probably fancy high rises, Class A. In other words, the more expensive types of building. So speaking of, I mentioned subsidized affordable housing. It is a really, really important part of the market. There's a portion of our of Americans who, due to how much they earn, probably will, no matter how much we build, it's going to be hard for them to kind of pay the market rent. But unfortunately, due to just the increase in costs in general for all kinds of housing, including market rate housing, and some of the rules and restrictions and regulations that and really cumbersome process that we have put on subsidized housing, costs have really skyrocketed. And so folks may have seen a couple of articles that were published, I think, midway through 2025 in the Washington Post about how expensive it has gotten to build affordable housing. I want to note that even for folks living in affordable housing, just building more housing overall is a really important part of the solution. And so what this slide shows, I want to note, the diagram is a little bit older. It's from a study in 2001. So 25 years ago. And as a result, what we now call the Housing Choice Voucher Program, used to be called Section 8. But what we're seeing here is that cities, so, for folks who don't know, the way that the, formerly Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher program works is that, in most cities, kind of depends on the local market, but essentially the local housing authority will give recipients of the voucher 6 months to find an apartment and rent it. And so, once you get that voucher, your kind of shot clock starts. Can you, find a place that's available for rent, and will they accept your voucher? And what we see here is that in very tight, in other words, markets that don't have very many available apartments because they haven't been building very much, tenants are much less likely to successfully get an apartment, only 61%. And it takes them a lot longer to get that apartment, 94 days. In contrast, when there are more apartments available, what on this slide is called loose markets, loose housing markets, they're more likely to get an apartment and do so more quickly. Speaking of homelessness, I want to note that so most people who are homeless, I think a lot of folks, especially certainly in the broader public, have this idea that homelessness is kind of this long-term intractable thing, and folks have been living on the streets for years and years. There is a portion of our homeless population that meets that caricature, but the reality is that the vast majority of folks, 78% of folks as of this 2024 point in time count, the homelessness count, were homeless for less than a year. And so it really tends to be people who fall off the bottom rung of the housing ladder because they can no longer afford the rent that often fall into homelessness. And then, either with the help of programs or family and friends, usually folks can find a way out of homelessness, fortunately, in less than a year. And this is important because it means that when we build more housing and there is more affordability in these particular markets that I'm profiling here and that we've profiled in our research, it's much easier for folks to find their way out of homelessness. So I'm going to show this in a kind of a few different ways. First, looking across comparison cities, then looking just within a city and state, and then finally looking at one city over time. And so in this case, we're looking at Phoenix and Tucson, obviously both in Arizona, as compared to Houston and Minneapolis. Phoenix and Tucson, they certainly added to their housing supply, 6%, not terrible, particularly compared to, some places like New York City or San Francisco. But compared to the number of people coming into those cities, especially priced out of California, high cost California, they just didn't build enough housing. And so rent shot up, 50, 60, close to 70%, and homelessness skyrocketed. Again, I compare that to Houston, Minneapolis, where rent growth was just much slower. And as a result, people were able to find their way out of homelessness. I should note that Houston has also had a very successful program to help bring people out of homelessness. Here, is a little kind of zoom in on Minneapolis specifically and comparing it to the state of Minnesota. And so again, the city has built a lot more housing than the state as a whole, kind of 12% as compared to the state. Now, this is while the city of Minneapolis, the population is growing faster than the rest of the state too. As a result, kept rent down and homelessness decreased. This is looking at a different city, Raleigh, North Carolina. They enacted a bunch of land use and zoning reforms that made it easier to build apartments, made it easier to build townhouses on smaller plots of land. And this change went into effect in 2021, a lot of these rule changes. And as a result, you can see the change from the blue bars, the earlier blue bars on the left, to the red bars on the right, that there was a really just an uptick in the number of homes that have been built. As a result, rent growth has been much slower, and more people, instead of more people becoming homeless, the homeless population, I'd say, is decreasing over time. And finally, I want to just note that, we've seen some really nice data coming out of Houston, Texas. What Houston has done, one of their most significant reforms to make it easier to build more homes, is instead of requiring that each home be built on 5,000 square feet of land, they have shrunk that, what's called a minimum lot size, to just 1,400 square feet. And so as a result, the city has added over 30% to its housing stock since the year 2000. And what you see here is that the both Black and Latino population in the city of Houston has increased, and for the Latino population, pretty significantly. And you compare that to our, three other largest cities, New York, LA, and Chicago, then both of them have struggled much more so to retain their Black and Hispanic population. And so in this case, we really see Houston as a success story in terms of being able to retain residents, people of color, minority residents who are often displaced out of high cost regions. So thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to share some of this research and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tushar. That was great. It's really also great to see the data from other cities, how they are navigating the challenge and what some of the data looks like in terms of increasing supply and some of the policies that have done that. I just really appreciate our panelists. This is a really complex issue. We're always getting questions. It's like, well, isn't there just one thing we could do that would fix this whole problem? And no, I think that your presentations also show like there needs to be a group of coordinated policies that address affordability. There's not a single sword that will change the trajectory of this problem. I'm going to just call on, there's been a lot of really good discussion in the chat. I'm calling on Yonah because I think the first two questions were really about cost. If you could just talk about your first two answers about rising interest rates affecting the DMV and also the cost of construction debt. And then I'm going to pivot over to Kate because you answered a question very directly. I think it was great. So yeah, why don't we start there?
Absolutely. So I think when it comes to housing investment and construction, we're seeing national trends and we're seeing regional trends. And these things are related, but not the same. So nationally, what we're seeing is this high cost of debt that has a number of factors associated with it. One is just that there's been a high degree of inflation in the economy overall. So that is going to impact the cost of debt. So we went from developers being able to get construction debt at 2 to 3% to developers getting debt at 7 or higher percent. And that has extreme impacts in terms of their ability to make projects financially feasible. At the same time, the ability of those same developers to charge increasing rents and increasing homes has not increased at the same rate. So even for these new projects, the amount of money that the developers expect to get once the project is completed cannot make up the difference when you take into account all that increase in construction debt cost. So that causes a national situation where you see declines in construction in general. There also was a really interesting New York Times article just a few days ago that I could put in the chat. I'll try to find it, where they basically look at the rate of increasing costs of construction in general, even ignoring the debt costs. And essentially, the cost of construction for new multifamily buildings and for infrastructure in general in the United States has gone up dramatically over the past 5 years. So you have high cost of debt, high cost of construction, lack of increasing incomes. Put those together, you have a problem at the national level with construction. Then at the DC level, you have two fundamental problems happening simultaneously. One is that our economy has been very negatively impacted by federal reductions in force and just the general federal situation right now that has made the economy in this region struggle mightily. And it's in recession compared to other parts of the country. And the second is that land costs in residential districts of the region, and especially in DC, have not come down enough to make new projects feasible because they continue to be very expensive. So that has made the DC market really struggle over the past few months and years.
Thank you. Kate, the question was really about what do you, the cost of doing nothing. So if you could comment on that, would be great.
Yeah, like I always love that question because there's sort of this want to just sort of close the doors and keep what we've got and keep it safe. But the counterfactual is not that we don't necessarily build. And particularly in a place like College Park. The College Park example is kind of really helpful. And I think in general, our transit-rich areas, I think Columbia Heights is another great example. There's a lot of ways they could have done Columbia Heights. The city chose to do a lot of different things there. But I think that the cost of doing nothing, right? We've got a captive demand. And the students were living somewhere. Now that's like if we just remain static across the region in terms of housing demand and population, and we didn't. And so that means that there's sort of two things that are coming together, which well, three probably, right? You've got a metro station. Pretty soon you're going to have two, three Purple Line stations, which we haven't really talked about. And then you've got growing demand in the region, growing population in the region, and still the student demand. And so the upshot, right, is not that we all, all the student, the fourplexes, or if you're an old UMD person, the Knox boxes remain affordable. The counterfactual is actually that they're going to increase in cost. And I think the other thing that we worry about and that we've been tracking along, particularly in the Purple Line, is the impact, and this is why I started looking at this question, was the impact on unsubsidized but affordable housing. And that's a huge part of the stock in our suburbs, right? We don't have, DC has an incredible stock of affordable housing for historical reasons I'm happy to talk about, but the region, right, the suburbs don't for other historical reasons that are very intentional in terms of trying to avoid affordable housing over the past 50, 70 years. And so what we have there is the stock of affordable housing that is unsubsidized and unprotected. And so we have to then think about this question of where do our students live? How do we start to meet demand? And in Prince George's County, to be clear, they have really the only other county in the state that had more permits than Prince George's County between 22 and 24 was Baltimore City for multifamily, right? And so Prince George's County has been building a ton of housing relative to its neighbors, but it still is really struggling to absorb that. But it is, again, keeping rents stable. So I think that's the important part. The counterfactual is that we don't build. That's what people say, and that's not. It's just that things become more affordable as people continue to move in because people are looking for housing. And I think Tushar's point about where do you move and who has housing choice versus who doesn't have housing choice, this is really critical in this conversation. There's a point at which you have nowhere else to go but homelessness.
Thank you. I'm kind of popcorning all over the place right now, but there's a great question in the chat from Danny DePietro. It says, Raleigh and Austin are being held up as examples of places with a ton of development right now. Can you help us understand how they are also experiencing some of the greatest rent growth and increasing homelessness is building, even at a very fast rate, still not keeping up with demand from population growth? So Tushar, can you, just put an answer forward on that based on your examples in Raleigh and Austin?
Sure. I mean, I think that there is, there's certainly both Austin and Raleigh saw very, very fast increases in costs, both for rents and home prices. Over the past 10 years or so. And you saw a kind of striking increase in Austin, for example, of people leaving high cost California, relocating to Austin from places like, San Francisco Bay Area, San Jose, Los Angeles, places like that. That has really shifted in the past couple of years. And so there was a very, very strong building boom in the early years of the pandemic when interest rates were quite low. And as a result, we saw a lot of headlines like housing market in Austin crashing, and they have kind of a negative tone because we as a society have gotten used to housing markets always going up. But the flip side of that is that actually housing becomes more affordable for a lot of folks. And so, from an investor perspective, yes, it could be seen as a crash, but for local Austinites, people struggling with making ends meet and paying the rent or paying their mortgage. It was we have seen some improvements in affordability in a bunch of places, including those cities that I showed on that slide, those 11 cities. So I wonder whether there might be a little bit of a kind of time lag with in the understanding about when it is that affordability was increasing, I should say decreasing versus increasing in places like Raleigh and Austin.
And just to, if you don't mind me building on that really quickly, Tushar, I think one thing that's funny about the American housing situation in general is that for decades, much of the American savings model has been premised on the idea that one of the best ways or the best way for middle class people to save money is to buy a home. And if that is the message that our federal government and many of our state and local governments are sharing, then the problem is that people who invest in a home want that home value to increase. And I think we have this, we struggle with this fundamental problem in our housing market where people who own property want that property to become more valuable because they want to be able to sell it and make some money off of it, perhaps to finance their retirement, perhaps to buy themselves a better house in the future. But at the same time, people who want to buy a home, people who are renters, for example, want those home values to go down. And so, I think that we are fundamentally going to struggle with this contradiction in the way that our housing market works. I think that Tushar is right that ultimately we need to add more supply, and frankly, people are going to not see as big of an increase in their housing values over the long term if we do add a lot more supply. But that is important to make sure that people do have access to affordable housing who need to enter the market.
And I would add, I mean, I always tell my students it's because I'm teaching planning students, and it's really tricky when people live in their savings account. You make different decisions about your neighborhood, you make different decisions about your renovations, but you're living in your savings account, and I think that compounds with historical notions about race and land use and neighborhoods, and that means that we also then end up with a political situation. And so this conversation is always so interesting because we know what should be done, but when people are living in their savings account and they're the ones who elect the officials, they're making different decisions, and they're calling their council members and they're calling their state senators and saying, "Hey, why are you trying to preempt local zoning?" So I think that's also just a really important piece, and it makes it really tricky.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised those points, Yonah and Kate. I think it's really important that we also center people, not someone else on this call, but center the people. Like, go through your day and think about what happens during your day. The security guard in that building, the person who teaches your child reading, go through your day and think about what those folks make, and think about economic mobility in our region, which is essentially just a wish at this point. People are not having an experience where there's greater economic opportunity in the state of Maryland. And in order for us to grow as a state, we are going to need to figure that out. And that is not something that people also are putting inside of this conversation about housing affordability. And I would just, think about that Pell Grant student, which people, the idea is like, okay, yeah, they're getting better and they're going to get an education and they're going to be able to live where?
Right.
We're not having those conversations also about specific people. I've been holding up an X-ray technician as my example. People can have a lot of anger about a lot of things, but we all need an X-ray technician. And my question is, where does the X-ray technician in your community, where are they going to live? So just with that, I'm one of the questions in the chat says, I understand the chart where more units means less rent growth for low income, but how did Tyson's and others build the large amount of units within the constraints of cost of money and construction? And that's just a different, also Maryland versus Virginia. If someone can address that, that would be great.
I'm happy to, jump in. I mentioned Tyson's, but, Kate and Yonah, despite Pew being based in DC, I should say, and I live in Montgomery County, but our work is more kind of national in focus. But so would love to hear Kate and Yonah speak to that also. Honestly, the cost of construction, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the cost of construction has really skyrocketed in the past 2 to 3 years. Yonah mentioned interest rates, cost of building materials. We're seeing shortages of labor, in the past year or so, especially. And so a lot of the building in Tyson's was done prior to that period. And you really see the, build up in Tyson's going back about 10 years and, kind of in parallel, or not in parallel, but around the same time as the extension of the Silver Line out to Tyson's. And so this is something that has been going on over a longer period of time. And look, I mean, I'll be candid, Tyson's, it's still expensive to live there. I'm not saying that Tyson's has become a mecca of affordability, but in all of these cases, the question is, how much and how quickly is the rent increasing? How quickly are home prices increasing? And as I think it was Kate who was saying earlier, that if we see sharp decreases, that means we're probably in a recession. Like that is also not a great situation for a lot of folks, and just stable employment and things like that, right? But if rent increases are kept much lower, as in Tyson's and some of those other cities I mentioned, it means that incomes will grow faster than rent, and housing will become more affordable over time. And so that's kind of the sweet spot that I would like us to be looking for. But Kate, Yonah, anything further to add about Tyson's?
I would just say that Virginia has historically been a lot easier place to build than Maryland. We've been discussing a lot recently about the role of vesting in your development in Maryland. So Maryland, as I've learned, is a late vesting state. In other words, the rules can change on you even after permitting. And so it means that you've got to be kind of ready for a lot of eventualities, and time is money, right? And so that time being money means that if a new law comes in, new regulation on construction, new regulation on zoning, that can destroy your whole sort of underwriting, your sort of pro forma and budget for the building. And so I think that's one piece that I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that's a huge issue. And I do think that it's important to call out that what Tushar was just saying, the last piece about like rents growing faster, or excuse me, incomes growing faster than rents ultimately. The other piece is that, connecting back to what Claudia was talking about, renters who are not rent burdened, in other words, not paying more than 30% of their income for rent or 50% of their income for rent, can actually begin to save money and start to move towards a down payment or towards reserves for a house. And so, you get put behind as an individual, as we center people again, if you're spending way too much on rent and you're never going to buy a house if that's the case. But that's a little off topic from this original question.
Great. I'm focusing on people's answers, people's questions in the chat and the Q&A. I think we should center the discussion around the folks that are here. So I'm just going down the list here. Aiden was asking about luxury housing and how can we build luxury housing while limiting the displacement of existing residents? Is it enough to just implement a 10% inclusionary zoning law for affordability in these new buildings? And honestly, anybody who wants to take that.
I'd love to take a stab at it. But, I know Yonah has looked at this also. Kate, I would obviously welcome your thoughts. So the reality is that the vast majority of the housing that is built today is luxury housing. I mean, that's kind of a popular term, or actually kind of a real estate marketing term, but basically it's all high-end housing because that is, the cost of building has become very high for interest rate, materials, labor, land costs, all the things that Yonah and others mentioned earlier. And so margins are thin, and luxury housing is what can still make a profit for the developer. And developers are in the business of being able to pay their workers and make money. And so it is luxury housing that's built. Now, according to our research, and that was the slide that I showed, in those cities that have built a lot of housing, building a lot of new housing, mostly luxury housing, reduces overall rents in the city, and it reduces them in particular for the most affordable apartments. And so from our perspective, there isn't actually really a tension outside of the very specific situation of a older home or building that's torn down and directly replaced with luxury housing, quote unquote. There are some differences of opinion about that, but by both our research and kind of the preponderance of research that we've looked at from other sources, academics, and the like, they're building new housing, including luxury housing, increases affordability overall and reduces displacement, regardless of whether you have an inclusionary zoning requirement or not.
So I would add to that. I think the overall picture, correct, right? We've read the research. We know. I think the other piece is really thinking about the preservation of affordable housing, and really like understanding where your affordable housing is. And I'm not just talking about the stuff that's been federally subsidized, but what's unsubsidized. And that's a really tough nut to crack. We're working on it in the Purple Line, it's been an exciting project, but that's so important to track because those are the buildings, like 2/3 of Americans who qualify for affordable housing resources cannot get them because there are not enough. And so most Americans are living, most low-income people are living in unsubsidized but affordable housing. So we have to think about how do we preserve. Now, there's two things that have to happen here. One is that you have to have subsidy. And people are like, well, we've got the low-income housing tax credit. And I'm just kind of answering one of the questions here that was earlier asked. But the low-income housing tax credit typically does not subsidize to an affordable to a way that meets need. And so we need state and local subsidies to address the need that is there. So that's actually really critical. The other part is to think about how to be creative in that space. So sometimes when we talk about preservation, people are like, oh, so you want to just keep all the 1970s garden style apartments that are in varying stages of repair. That's not necessarily the question, right? Like the affordability is the question, and the ability for people to remain in their communities is the question. And so if you can do that by thinking about, okay, what can the site allow? Right, we know, and we know, again, we're working again in the Maryland suburbs, and so we think about these sites that are often very large sites with enormous parking lots and 3 to 4 stories maybe of buildings. There's a lot that can be done, especially in a transit-oriented development space, to upzone the space and even, frankly, build first and move tenants into a new building before you build the second side. And then you can do both, right? And that's really... This is something that I think is really important. We have very creative people out there, very smart people who can start to develop models, and we have to be developing these models. I say this about myself as a researcher and those of us in the room. Developers, as Tushar said, are in the business of making money and paying their employees and developing buildings. And they sort of are, look, I've got this building, I got it developed, I'm moving on to the next building. They aren't sort of taking the time to say, hey, wow, how can I be really super creative? Because that's expensive. Frankly, the time is money piece. And so I think that's part of the thing is how can we be creative both with our financing and with our design, with our zoning, with the existing land that we have, and really do something that could be impactful and allow us to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yonah, I'm not sure if you want to jump in here. One thing I just want to mention around my line that Kate just referenced around developers and home builders being in this business to make money. I will note that we have seen examples of places where, because the rules around what kind of housing can be built have been opened up, and it's easier to build different kinds of housing. Developers, they don't necessarily and automatically only build the most expensive types of housing, right? And so, there's some really nice examples, for example, coming out of Portland, Oregon, which has made it much, much easier to build duplexes, fourplexes, even 6 and 8plexes. And there are, you see the same in Raleigh, North Carolina, one of those cities I mentioned, where developers, home builders have switched from, tearing down a smaller house, something we see a lot of in this region in the DMV, and building a much bigger single family house on that same lot, to instead building plexes, building townhouses and building, these fourplexes or sixplexes. And those are more affordable for the average person. And you can get, multiple families living on that same piece of land that would have been just one much wealthier family.
The only thing I will add just very quickly is that I think the phenomenon of renters living in older buildings that Kate mentioned, like garden style apartments, and being displaced by new development is something we do need to take seriously. It is something we need to consider as we're developing new policies for adding homes in neighborhoods. We've seen some examples in California where new legislation that generally increases zoning capacity also has requirements that existing rental units cannot be demolished in favor of a new project. I'm not saying that necessarily is the right approach in every case, but it's an example of one way that we can protect existing renters from being displaced by new development. So, I think we need to keep that in mind as we're moving forward.
Yeah, I think this also just gets to the question of like, what are the limits? The one question to Tushar, like, is that 10% inclusionary enough? And, what are the limits of subsidy and zoning? You know what I mean? Is there like, what's the right balance there in terms of policy? And how can those policies work together? Because again, I do think there's always like, oh, if we do this, everything else will take care of itself. But it's a lot more nuanced. And, I'm also interested in the question in the chat, like what type of housing is being built on the smaller lots in Houston. I do think that there's always like, oh, it's going to be all this type of housing, right? And the truth is, it's a lot more dynamic within the market. Like, people sort of talking about like, oh, we don't want more garden style apartments. Okay, well, what do we want? What does it look like? What does the market need in terms of like what's missing? So I'm just gonna, I'm gonna start with you on the like, how can we work on the subsidy and the zoning? Because you were just talking about that a little bit.
Well, there's no easy solution because it costs money to provide subsidies to people. I absolutely think we need to be investing simultaneously in zoning changes that encourage additional market rate housing construction while also providing supports for people with lower incomes who are not going to be addressed by the current housing market, no matter how much construction you have. The reality is that there's a large share of households, maybe 20%, who are not going to find housing that's affordable, even in a situation where all the housing in the world was being built. So we need public supports to preserve housing that's available to them. And we can do that in a number of different ways. One is to provide additional vouchers so that people with lower incomes can rent in other market rate units. A second is to provide direct assistance to the construction or preservation of housing that is guaranteed affordable for people with lower incomes. So that can be done in a whole variety of different ways. The tax credit is one, though it's a bit moderate income, but other options are federal subsidies like project-based Section 8, public housing, which unfortunately the federal government has not been expanding for the last few decades. Nonetheless, states and localities can provide supports that are equivalent to those. And the third is, frankly, supports for renters that can guarantee their ability to stay in place, even when the market around them is changing. Those supports can come in the form of rent stabilization, such as regulations that ensure that landlords can't jack up the rent in cases where people just want to remain in their homes. So I think we need to be thinking about addressing the affordability challenge from all those different perspectives simultaneously.
Claudia, I would love to quickly jump in on that also. I think Yonah mentioned some great types of policies that can help those who really just don't make enough money to be able to afford market rate rents, even if we were to build a lot more housing. I think that that's a reality. From I think my perspective, my team's perspective at Pew, probably the kind of more direct supports, such as the low-income housing tax credit, housing trust fund, other programs to support the building of more affordable housing, direct supports to tenants like housing choice voucher. Those are probably kind of a little bit more simple and straightforward in terms of providing lower income renters the help they need. There's been a bunch of research that inclusionary zoning, at least in many contexts, can actually decrease the amount of overall housing that's built. And so, yes, you do get some affordable units, but overall, in many cases, it has decreased overall affordability in that city or metro area because you have fewer homes built overall. And so there's a kind of perverse or unintended effect there that can kick in with mandatory inclusionary zoning. And so there are, I think, other mechanisms of the type that both I and Yonah mentioned that can build that needed housing and help people pay their rent without discouraging the building of more housing.
And I would say there's sort of a couple things that have been done in our region that I think are really helpful. One is I would be remiss if I didn't mention a right of first refusal, which either gives tenants or the jurisdiction the right to buy or assign the rights to a building in the event of a sale. And that does a couple of things that are really important. One is with the tenant piece, it gives them sort of a stake in their future, which is something that I think is really critical. People often think about renters as temporary, but my research, I interview people all the time who are like, I've been in the same unit for 29 years. That doesn't seem temporary to me. And so that's really important. It also works with the market, so it's able to go with the cycles of what's going on. Related to that is permanent funding of a sort of a dedicated funding source for a trust fund. And I think DC's base trust fund source is deed and recordation taxes. So as it's 15% of those. So as the market heats up, the trust fund increases. The district has also taken the step of topping off the trust fund over the past few years, past 10 years, really. And that's really important because, when I worked for the district in the early 2000s, in 2008, it was really amazing. We had $65 million. In 2009, we had $12 million. And that was just the recession. And so we could do very little, which was really kind of hobbling. And the last piece is, yes, we talk about local vouchers, which are really important because the local jurisdiction can control them, very similar to the housing choice voucher. If you have a local voucher, though, you really can do better with your work because the jurisdiction can control them a little bit better than the housing authority, but to be able to place-base them where they need to be. There are things like permanent supportive housing for formerly unhoused people. But I think one of the interesting things that several cities, including DC, have been experimenting with are shallow vouchers, because a lot of folks are kind of on the edge and can almost afford housing and don't maybe need the full voucher, but they do need help because either their income is unstable, right? Your hours can be cut at any time, or maybe you have a sick kid and you're working an hourly wage. You need something to help it move on. And so these cash-based rental assistance can be really helpful at a shallow level to help folks stay stabilized, but not take the full voucher that is 30% of your income that you may or may not need, but you don't want to give up because you're otherwise going to be on the waiting list for 12 years. So I think there's sort of some really creative things that have been happening in our region. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention HOC's work, Montgomery County's work on sort of owning the land and having a stake in the land in the buildings. It means you still have the developer and you still have the owner operator, but that the county actually has a direct stake in keeping it affordable. I could go on, but these are some of the ones that are sort of bubbling to mind right now.
Oh, no, that's great. Thank you so much, Kate. I'm going to try to weave together some things that are in the chat and some things that questions that we were talking about. So I'm interested in the sort of innovation, construction innovation. Is, one, accessory dwelling units, ADUs, manufactured housing. What are we doing to accelerate the speed of production, and what can some of the, like, are these policies that we see that could be implemented in the region that would accelerate the speed and amount of affordable housing development? Honestly, near transit, I'll even put that in there. Are there innovations and policies that we also need to be thinking about in the coming years?
I will say one of the interesting things that came out of the Moore administration, I think last year, was that modular housing is treated the same as single family homes for zoning purposes at the state, or it's required to be. There's been some challenges in at the local level of trying to kind of implement those regulations, and everyone's sort of trying to figure out what that means. But I think that's doing is this opportunity to sort of create a demand, which is really important. Maryland doesn't have any production of modular housing, but our surrounding states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, particularly do. And so I think that's an interesting place. BMOD, the Baltimore folks are working on additional pieces around that. But it's something that I know our partners at Maryland DHCD have been thinking a lot about, and how do we kind of reduce the costs through sort of this embedded capacity that you have it all inspected. But there's a lot of like logistical pieces to get through to make that possible, unfortunately.
Jump in briefly to say that housing, that's kind of home building industry, has not seen the increases in efficiency that we've seen with a lot of other industries in the country. And so you still predominantly have folks going on site using hammers and nails to build homes in the same way it was done 50 or 100 years ago. And so certainly, there's, I think, room for technological innovation. Where that comes from is, I think, a little bit more of an open question. One of my colleagues at Pew does a lot of work focused on manufactured housing. I think that there's some promise there. If you actually, folks want to take a trip out to Hagerstown, Maryland, there is a whole subdivision going up, built of manufactured homes. These are high quality homes. I went and toured them, like beautiful homes. And so, manufactured housing has come a long way from its historic stereotype of trailer parks. But part of the reason why that development is out in Hagerstown is because the land costs are sufficiently low. And that's, pretty far from DC. Right. And so late in the Biden administration, there was a policy change such that you could use manufactured housing for up to fourplexes. In other words, 4 homes kind of all on the same lot put together. In order to help that, there's getting into all kinds of wonky stuff. But right now, manufactured homes are required to have this like big steel chassis, like think about chassis, I should say. Think about like a thing that wheels are attached to that gets rolled down the highway, permanently attached. And Congress needs to change that. They're working on it, and that would help. So I think that to sum up, there may very well be some innovations in building technology and the like that could help bring down costs. It does not seem to me, and the research that I've looked at, that is going to be the primary vehicle for making housing more affordable. I think that some of these other policy changes we've been talking about are probably more likely.
And just to jump in quickly, I think there is a lot of opportunity for accessory dwelling units as a means of deploying a substantial increase in housing availability at a relatively quick speed. But in order to make ADUs possible, you need a number of baseline conditions which are not really present in the DC region right now. So First of all, you need pre-approved plans from the jurisdictions. In theory, it'd be great if all the jurisdictions in the region could come together and agree on a set of pre-approved plans for ADUs that could be implemented in any jurisdiction in the metropolitan area. I think it'd be great. Second, all the jurisdictions and perhaps the states need to agree that there are no home ownership requirements, that there are no parking requirements, and there are minimal site requirements for ADUs, meaning you don't have to have very many setbacks, you don't have to have a minimum size for the ADU unit, etc. And the last is, that ADUs should be allowed to be built off-site, which is a relationship with the manufacturing process. I think a lot of these changes that I just described have been implemented in California, in the cities of Portland and Seattle, and they have benefited from a very large investment in ADUs all over their communities. And we can see something similar in DC and the suburbs if we get that stuff going. So, I think there's opportunity there, but it requires concerted effort by the jurisdictions.
I'd like to lift up though the conversation about regional pieces, right? This is something that we hear about all the time is I remember years ago I was working on regulations for IZ with the district, and we had different views from different interest groups, and one of the groups that works on inclusionary zoning in another jurisdiction, a building industry group, they were like, look, we don't care, just tell us the rules and we'll do it. And the thing I took from that was that we need clarity of rules, ideally consistency of rules, because it's hard to jump jurisdictions. And our community is not, our region is not that large ultimately, right? We have developers who work across borders. They it's easier or harder. They have people who are experts in places. But at the end of the day, we have a regional housing market and regional housing actors in the affordable space and the for-profit space. So we really need to, I think, have this conversation amongst the housing directors. I know that that's happening a little bit with COG, but I think getting down to some of these nitty-gritty pieces, I think would be really, really powerful, particularly around things like modular housing and other sorts of rules. Just because, frankly, I know that's pie in the sky because this is very political. But if I had my druthers, I would have some cooperation and conversation across the region.
Wow, great. Thank you guys so much. I am going to kick it back to Carrie, but thank you to the audience. All your great questions kind of just swallowed my agenda, but we had just great questions from everyone on the call today. Really appreciate it. Carrie, back to you. Thanks again for the honor of moderating this discussion.
No, thank you, Claudia, and thank you to all of our panelists. I thought this was such a great discussion, and I see we still have, looks like 25 questions in the Q&A. So, you guys just asked such great questions today that we couldn't get to all of them, but really appreciate everyone taking the time to be here today. It was really exciting for CSG to be able to share this webinar with you. Affordability is a key part of what we're working for as we build walkable, transit-oriented, bikeable communities with housing that all people can afford. So we have a team of about 8 people. We are covering DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And the best way to keep up with the work we're doing there, both during the state legislative session and at the local level, is to join our mailing list and follow us on social media. So we'll share updates with you about how you can continue to be involved in advocating on these issues. And we can't do this work without supporters like all of you who are here today. So thanks so much for joining us and have a great rest of your afternoon.